Today's lecture will be over Chapter 4, Section 5, Objectives. Number 1, identify the 4 basic types of economic systems. Number 2, define the 4 levels of economic activity. Number 3, distinguish among renewable, non-renewable, and inexhaustible resources. Number 4, identify key components of economic support systems. And number 5, distinguish between gross national product and gross domestic product, and between developing and developed nations. So we have gone through in Chapter 4 and we've talked about different things. We've talked about our politics. We've talked about kind of how suburbs kind of emerge and the cities and things like that. Culture, when we talked about Chapter 4, Section 1. Today we're going to talk about the economy and economics. This is something that we can talk about in great detail. There's a lot of different things about economics that we can pursue, but we just want to give a generalization on this. Economy is a production and exchange of goods and services. So what we're talking about in economics is basically how do we transfer items and for what cost. So for example, if I buy something, do I trade things? Do I give them money? What type of system do we have? Does the government tell me what I have to buy? Does the government tell me what I have to sell? All of that goes into our economic systems. Economies can be local, they can be regional, they can be national, and they can be international. Usually when we think about economies, we think about the United States economy, but the Nebraska economy is important. The economy of eastern Nebraska is important, along with Fremont. So different types of economies call for different types of things. Geographers study economics for a couple different reasons. Number 1, how people in the region support themselves. For example, in Nebraska, a lot of people farm. That's going to affect how we govern ourselves, where that's going to affect the laws that we pass. It's going to affect our culture. Also, we look at how economic activity is linked regionally. How are we connected to the Midwest? How is the Midwest connected to the West and the East Coast and the South? So all of these have a connection in our economic systems. Now, an economic system is that ways people produce and exchange goods and services. So goods and services are basically things that I make, and how do I exchange them? How do I transfer them, ownership from one person to the other? Now, there's 4 main basic type of economic systems that we look at. The first is a traditional system, and this is what we call bartering. So for example, in the olden days, I might go to somebody and I might say, hey, I got a bunch of chickens, I'll trade you 10 chickens for 1 cow. And that would be a barter system. It's simple trading. Now there's positive and negative effects of this. For example, I might trade 10 chickens for 1 cow, but I might go to somebody else and expect the same type of trade, and somebody say, absolutely not, I want 50 chickens for 1 cow. It's very difficult. Also, taxation, being able to tax on trading of goods really can't happen. So it becomes difficult when we start looking at this traditional system. The next 2 become kind of the systems that people kind of know about. We have a command or a planned economy, and we have a market economy that's also known as capitalism. A command economy, if you're looking for a definition, is when the government owns the means of production. So they decide what is produced, they decide what price is set. You also have a market economy, and this is based on capitalism. Capitalism says that the people will decide what basically we are going to sell and how we're going to sell it. Our market economy is based on somebody by the name of Adam Smith, and he wrote what's called, he basically wrote a book that is called The Invisible Hand. And what it was is that it says that the American people would, and not the American people I shouldn't say, but people that fall under capitalism, basically capitalism is going to control everything. So for example, if I decide that I want to go and I want to make coffee, but I say that I'm going to price it at $50 for a cup of coffee, and it's a bad cup of coffee. According to Adam Smith, what happens is that I will go out of business because, number 1, nobody's going to pay $50 for a cup of coffee. Number 2, people are not going to want to have a bad cup of coffee. So for me, the best thing I can do is make a cheap cup of coffee, and I make it the best I can possibly make. That's market economy, is that people decide the price by if they want to buy it or sell it. Now we have what's interesting is that most people think that there's a kind of a line in the sand, that you either have a command economy or you have a mixed or a market economy, when in fact most of the time we have what's known as a mixed economy, and it's a combination of a command economy and a market economy. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson was a guy, of course, we all know him as a president, but he was actually somebody that believed in what's known as a laissez-faire form of government. And what he said was that the government that governs best governs least. And so what he said is that, hey, let the American people decide. You do whatever they want. He believed in a true form of capitalism. Well, the problem was, what we found is that in the early 1900s, we had people like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller. These guys basically owned the entire industry on selling things, and what they would do is that they would bump out their competitors and then they would raise the prices. This is called a monopoly. Teddy Roosevelt decided that that wasn't fair, and he actually created, kind of pushed laws through that said that you could not have a monopoly. That's why monopolies are actually illegal. That is a form of a command economy, because the government is deciding what you can and can't do in your economic system. So the point is that the system that we have is a little bit of a mixed economy. The government can tell us what we can do, but we also have form of a market economy. Other countries have got a little bit more command economy, where the government dictates what's going on, but they do let people kind of decide what prices that they want. So again, a lot of the mixed economies is the economies that you're going to see worldwide. Now, there's different types of economic system. Make sure that you know something that's called subsistence agriculture. What this is that this is when you basically are going to raise food for your own self. Most of the first world countries, most of the developing countries have subsistence agriculture. So what I would do is, if I lived in an area of subsistence agriculture, I would go out and I would produce just enough food for myself and my family. I wouldn't sell it at all, because I needed it to basically live. Now, raising food to sell is called a market-oriented agriculture. Some people call this commercial agriculture. And again, this is when I go out there and I produce so much that I can actually sell it, and when I sell it, I can trade with that money. So we also have a cottage industry. This involves a small home-based industrial production. Cottage industries are kind of the mom and pop selling, pies or something like that. Those would be cottage industries. We also have large industrial production, and you have to have this for commercial industries. You have to have that large scale industry, and this is when you start shifting from your developing countries to developed. Basically that large scale industry. Now, we also have 4 different levels of economic activity. Your primary industry is gathering raw materials for immediate use. So a good example of this is somebody that goes out and cuts down trees for a living, a logger. They would be involved in the primary industry because they are actually cutting down the raw materials. A person that uses those raw materials to make something would be involved in a secondary industry. And that would be somebody like a cabinet maker. They're basically going to go ahead and they're going to cut the trees. They're going to go ahead and they're going to make the cabinets up. They're not going to go out and they're not going to cut down the wood. They're going to buy the wood from somebody, and then they're going to make something out of it. The first 2 industries are becoming less and less as the United States evolves into the next 2 areas. The next 2 areas are much more common in the United States. Tertiary involves business or professional services. This might be a doctor, a lawyer. This might be somebody like a teacher. You also have a quaternary, and quaternary is actually a growing industry. They provide information, management, research services. This would be somebody that might go out there and they might look at surveys and give a survey and then try to figure out what the best way for a business to run. That would be a quaternary industry. So again, 4 different levels of economic activity. Now, we also have to use things for our economy, and those are going to be resources. Natural resources are Earth's materials that have economic value. That might be things like water. That might be things like crops. That might be things like trees. Material becomes resources when they can be turned into goods. So what we have to do is that we have to use those things to make something. Iron, metals, those things become basically materials that become resources when we can turn around and start to sell them. Now, when we look at this, geographers divide the resources into 3 different types, and you've probably heard about the first 2. The first one is going to be renewable resources. These are things that can be naturally replaced. These can be things like trees. These can be things like seafood. All of those can be naturally replaced. We also have non-renewable resources. These are metals, oil, coal. These can't be replaced, and once we use them up, we use them up. up. Now, what's interesting is that most people categorize the inexhaustible resources and renewable resources, and that's not true. Inexhaustible resources are things like sun and wind that have unlimited resources. What are we talking about here? What we mean is that if I go out there and I look at inexhaustible resources, if I get a solar panel and I plug in my phone charger into that solar panel, as long as that sun is bright, that's going to continue to charge my phone. It will never run out. If I go and I decide that I'm going to cut down the trees because they're renewable resources, and I cut down all the trees in the entire planet, for the next 50 years or so, or maybe not 50, but for the next 10 years, we may not have trees because it's going to take some time for them to grow. So renewable resources, yes, they can kind of recharge themselves, they can become new again, but it takes time. Whereas inexhaustible resources, we can run wind power, we can run solar power, we can run that all day, all night, because of that. And not solar power, of course, but wind power, you could run that all day and all night and it will never run out. Now, natural resources are a major part of the world trade, and basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to trade and you're trying to get what you need for your country. For example, Nebraska, or the United States, we have a lot of things. We've got crops, we've got fishing industry, we basically have got everything, but we go out and we buy things like oil because there's a high need for that, and that's why we have to continue to trade and do the best that we can. Infrastructure, this is a basic support system to sustain economic growth. These are things like power, communications, transportation systems, water, sanitation, education systems. So what we see is that our infrastructure is basically what makes, it's a support system that makes our cities and towns better. For example, a good one here is roads. If you might sit here and you might have gravel road. Okay, that's okay for an infrastructure. If you have a paved road, that's even better. If you create a highway, that's even better because you're going to be able to trade faster. If you create an interstate, that's going to be the best thing. So infrastructures are important, things like airports and so on and so forth. All of that improve infrastructure. Communication systems and technology are also critical to this area, or to the economic systems. Now, when we look at economies, we want to be able to connect them, and we want to be able to look at one economy to the next country's economy. Per capita income is the average earning per person in a political unit. We need to make sure that we have this because we want to look at countries. For example, if I looked at, let's say that I wanted to look at Luxembourg, which has got a very, very small population, and I wanted to compare their economy to India. India has got over 1 billion people. Luxembourg isn't even close to that. So if I just look at the amount of money a country makes, India is going to have way more because they've got more people. But if you actually look per capita and you say, okay, on average, what does the average person make? You're going to see Luxembourg is going to be much more than India. So it's basically a way we can compare throwing out numbers. Now, we also have something with gross national product, gross domestic product. Make sure that you get these because these are going to be important, and we're going to talk about throughout the entire world when we start going over countries. Gross national product. This is a statistic to measure the total value of goods and service produced by a country globally. That is incredibly important to see globally. So, for example, in the United States, gross national product would include everything that happens inside our borders of the United States, but it would also include all of the businesses that are outside the United States. Now, if we're looking and we want to say, okay, how much are Americans making worldwide, we look at gross national product. But if we look at gross domestic product, that is only inside our country. So, for example, if we want to look and we want to say how many businesses inside the United States are making money and how good are they doing, we look at gross domestic product, because gross domestic product looks at what the people of America are making. Gross national product includes everything globally. So if you've got a company that's located in India, the people are actually making money in India. Now, of course, the business is from the United States and some of that money goes to them, but the money also is going outside of the country. So again, gross national product, globally. Gross domestic product, that's going to be within the country. And then last but not least, when we look at this, we're also going to see developing nations versus developed nations. Developing nations have low gross domestic product, low per capita. They are not doing very good. Developing is kind of the word that we use to say that they're trying to do better. Developed countries means they've gone through the Industrial Revolution. Everything is good in terms of economics, and they are making money. They are using your primary industries, your secondary, your quaternary, your tertiary, everything. So that makes it so that the countries are doing better. Developing countries are usually poor. Developed countries are on the more wealthy side. This completes our lecture over Chapter 4, Section 5. Please complete the assessments at this time.